did a research project in 2016, just before my academic career blew up, where we were looking at predictors of politically correct authoritarianism. First of all, we established that such a thing existed. All protestations to the progressive social psychologists to the contrary, there was a coherent set of left-wing authoritarian beliefs, and you could identify them statistically. And then the question was, what predicted them? Okay, we found three major predictors, and we had no a priori presumption about this. The first predictor was low verbal intelligence. And so when you ask yourself, well, how could people be daft enough to believe such things? Well, one of the answers to that our research showed was that, well, people who swallowed those ideologies weren't that smart. And so they were very much likely to dominate those academic subdisciplines that attracted the least cognitively able people. Okay, so it was a big predictor. The correlation between IQ and politically correct authoritarianism was higher than the correlation between cognitive ability, IQ, and grades. It was a whopping predictor.
Doesn't surprise me, yeah.
So that's bad enough. Here's the kicker, though. There were two other major predictors, three actually. The first was being female.
I was going to say that.
Yeah. The second was having a female temperament. That was an additional predictor over and above being female. The third was having ever taken a politically correct course. Okay, so now that, you pointed out that this ethos of harm avoidance, let's say, something like that, this protective ethos started to dominate. Well, no one has been courageous enough or foolhardy enough to broach the possibility that the reason for that is that the universities became dominated by not only women, this is even worse, I might as well go in all the way, childless women.
Yeah.
Right. And that's...
Well, actually, there are a couple of papers on that, Jordan. I'm sure you've seen, I think Corey Clark, and I've read a couple, I think, showing basically the feminization of higher education over the last 50 years. But there's something else, listening to you, that just came into my mind. I don't know if you've read it. There's a book by a psychologist called Luke Conway that came out, I think, a year ago, called Liberal Bullies. And what he has done, which is fascinating, is he's gone back and looked at all the old stuff on right-wing authoritarianism and the scales that they used comparing right-wing authoritarians with left-wing authoritarians. And of course, the old argument, this is, going back 50 years of social science, was that you don't get left-wing authoritarians, you only get right-wing authoritarians.
Yeah, what a lie that was.
And the whole literature, right, has just been debunked, because what Conway is saying, well, if you change the scales, because they were measuring right-wing authoritarianism differently from left-wing authoritarianism, if you use the same scales on both, what you find is that so-called liberals are actually more prone to authoritarian impulses and tendencies than conservatives. And if anything explains the last 15 years in Western politics, the kind of great awakening, all of the, fanaticism and dogmatism that we saw around Black Lives Matter and the social justice movement, it's this take. I read his book and I was like, there it is. So basically, social scientists were misleading everybody. I would say maybe they knew about it. Maybe they were just lying to people. And here we have evidence that if you identify as highly liberal, you are more prone to authoritarian impulses than conservatives.
Okay. So they were definitely at least lying by omission. Like, I got into the study of left-wing authoritarianism sort of sideways, because I'm a personality and clinical psychologist, not a social psychologist. And the people who studied right-wing authoritarianism, or authoritarianism, let's say, were social psychologists. And so then I had to master the social psychological literature. And I found, to my absolute bloody shock, what you just described, which was that for 60 years, the social psychologists essentially had insisted that there was no such thing as left-wing authoritarianism. And I thought, well, what do you mean there's no such thing as left-wing authoritarianism, for Christ's sake? Who the hell do you think Stalin was, and Mao? That's not left-wing murderous authoritarianism, and that's why we did this research. But here's another thing that's horrible, and I don't know if Conway has dealt with this, and I didn't know about the book, and I will read it. See, the pattern of cancel culture is the same pattern as female antisocial behavior. So there's a literature on antisocial behavior that's sex typed. So antisocial males are violent. They're physically violent. And they're criminal for that regard, and they tend to get thrown in prison because of it, because we don't tolerate violent crime. White-collar crime's not so bad. You can defund 1 million people out of their pension, but you don't want to mug someone. And, I can understand that because people are afraid of being physically assaulted. But we definitely have a differential scale of justice when it comes to economic damage. Anyways, female antisocial types, they don't use physical aggression. They use gossip, reputation savaging, and like camouflaged aggression, right? And so you could imagine, this is a very ugly hypothesis, but there's no reason to assume that women are going to be any less pathological in their social behavior than men. It'll just take a different form.
So I was just going to say, I would say the evidence on cancel culture, comprehensive, rigorous surveys across the West is pretty consistent in showing that female scholars, especially young female PhD students, are consistently the most likely to endorse a range of cancel culture measures. They're the most likely, for example, to say that we should sacrifice academic freedom and free speech on the altar of protecting minorities from harm. So I think that's a big part of the story. Again, it's controversial, and the fact that we would struggle to have this debate at an Oxford, union debate or on Cambridge campus is itself a reflection of the problems within universities. I think it's an enormous part. And in politics too, by the way. I think if you look at the people who have been most dogmatic when it comes to the debates over migration, net zero, who have refused to look at the issue of the rape gangs, have refused to give the country a national inquiry routinely. Routinely, it's been prominent women in national political life. And I think there's also, by the way, been a lot of hypocrisy there too. If you just take the case of the rape gangs, the whole Me Too scandal, middle class liberal professional women who didn't say anything at all about young white working class girls being raped, harassed, and abused by Muslim gangs. And there's just, I think people aren't stupid. They can see a lot of this stuff that's playing out before them.
Well, it's a good thing that neither of us have academic jobs anymore, because if we had them, this conversation would have done them in for like 7 different reasons.